Good morning, everyone. I hope today finds you well. It's a gorgeous day, so I decided to hold the lecture outside. We'll see how long this lasts. I think my entire neighborhood is doing lawn care this morning, so I may have to edit out some leaf blowers and lawnmower sounds later on in the day. So first, a little bit about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was born in Scotland. He was born to Irish Catholic parents. Even though he had wealthy extended family, his own family was never very well off. That is due mostly to his father's alcoholism and rather abusive temperament. Doyle's family never really spent too much time together. He and his mother lived in tenement housing in very low-income areas for most of Doyle's childhood, until Doyle was of school age to be sent away to Jesuit school, which was paid for by his wealthier extended family. Doyle did not have a good time in Jesuit school. He found Jesuit school to be very harsh and unrelenting. At the age of 17, he enrolled in medical school at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. During his studies, he practiced botany as a hobby, and that would later turn out to be a boon for his career because he became very well known and respected in the medical field as a student early on by publishing several publications about certain poisonous plants. And that not only helped him out in his medical career, but also helped him out in his career as an author, specifically in the genre of detective fiction. Many of his Sherlock Holmes stories revolved around the use of poison plants. He tried for a very long time to make it in the medical profession, even though throughout his entire career and his entire study, he was writing his short fiction all throughout the 1880s. He traveled around as a ship's surgeon for a while, which is very dark and grim work under very hostile working conditions. In the late 1880s, he went to Germany to study ophthalmology, which is, of course, eye surgery. In 1891, he finally returned to London and attempted to establish his own private practice. And as far as all records indicate, that practice was never very successful. He never had that many clients and did not perform any surgeries. So ultimately, his career as a medical practitioner became somewhat of a non-starter, which was certainly of no small disappointment to Doyle himself. But by 1891, he was already pretty famous as being the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories. He published his first Sherlock Holmes novel in 1887. It was entitled A Study in Scarlet. He sold it for a pittance. He did not think of himself as an author at this time. He sold the rights to that story for very little money, but was contracted for more stories, which he would publish most of his Sherlock Holmes stories serially, mostly in magazines like The Strand, which is where the Speckled Band first appeared. Between 1887 and 1993, Doyle wrote 24 short stories featuring Sherlock Holmes. It's hard to really state how insanely popular Sherlock Holmes became. It revitalized the crime fiction genre, which was already fairly well established and kind of international. Mark Twain even wrote some crime fiction novels, if you ever get a chance to read Pudd'nhead Wilson. It's one of the first stories that makes use of fingerprinting to solve its crime. But more importantly, it put the focus of crime fiction more squarely on the detective. Sherlock Holmes is just such an interesting and well-wrought character. He is incredibly perfect in many ways. By 1893, Doyle's medical career was pretty much in the can, and Doyle decided he was going to make his living as an author. But like a lot of artists, he didn't really want to be pigeonholed into doing one kind of thing. A lot of creative types throughout history resent the popularity of any one thing that they have created because they find it limiting and stymieing. And Doyle actually tried to kill off Sherlock Holmes in 1903 with a story called The Final Problem, in which he and his arch-villain, Professor Moriarty, throw each other off of a waterfall to their certain demise. And Doyle wanted to wash his hands of the Sherlock Holmes character, but the outcry of Sherlock Holmes' death was so great, and the success of Doyle's other writings and his other characters was so limited that he revives Holmes in 1901 with the novel The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is probably the most well-known of all the Holmes novels. Doyle would go on to write 54 short stories and 4 novels total containing the characters of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. It is without a doubt the most successful oeuvre of one single character up to that point. Doyle tried to branch out into other series. He created another character by the name of Professor Challenger. Professor Challenger had 3 novels dedicated to his adventures, the most famous of which was The Lost World. It's a story about traveling to the heart of darkness, Africa, and discovering a land where dinosaurs still exist. You may have seen some retellings of The Lost World in your lifetime. In the late 90s, there was a rather short-lived television series based around The Lost World. Perhaps, lamentably, many of Doyle's other works were more well-received by critics, and in terms of being considered for their artistic merit. A lot of people think that Sherlock Holmes was not Doyle's best work, but it was without a doubt his most popular. And it set him up for a life of leisure. He really was kind of a quintessential success story. Outside of his work as an author, Doyle was very active in politics. He was a Freemason. He was a lifelong and avid sportsman. He was also a little bit of an amateur sleuth himself. He was known for having solved at least 2 different cold cases in his lifetime. Took it upon himself, sort of in an amateur fashion, to carry on the investigation, and so he was not altogether unsuccessful in his life. He died when he was 71. His last words were recorded as being to his wife, where he said simply to her, "You are wonderful." Kind of sweet. Now, as far as the Speckled Band goes, I'll assume, of course, at this point that everyone has read the story. The plot is very simple and in many ways very formulaic. Not only formulaic to the crime fiction genre as a whole, but by this point, his own writing of Sherlock Holmes stories had become very formulaic. He had a pattern that he followed pretty much to the letter any time that he wrote a Sherlock Holmes story. One of the tricks to writing good detective fiction is being aware of the relationship between the story and the audience. As the audience reads a good detective story, they're going to constantly try to figure it out. They're going to constantly try to solve the crime before Sherlock Holmes does. So a good detective story needs to be complex, but not too complex that an audience feels stupid, but also complex enough that they don't figure it out right away and are surprised by the end. One thing to bear in mind as you think about good detective stories and Sherlock Holmes stories in general is that around this time in the late Victorian era, in the 1880s and the 1890s, there were certain aspects of science that became very popular. Popular in the sense that your average person who did not necessarily have much scientific training still knew enough about certain scientific principles. There was a certain general understanding that a lot of people in Britain at this time just sort of had about things that pertain to the somewhat burgeoning field of forensic investigation. There are things that are kind of ubiquitous now. If you watch Law and Order, if you watch CSI, they talk about things like fingerprints, blood analysis, ballistics. It's just very commonplace, but these were very new things at the time. And these were things that excited the public in many ways. In terms of context, in terms of things outside of the story that are reflected within the story, this is a story that was written in the late 19th century. Late 19th century Britain was at its peak. There's the popular phrase that the sun never set on the British Empire, which is just the idea that Britain had a foothold all around the world. British culture was, for lack of a better way of saying it, very fond of itself. And it looked upon itself with a certain pride and a certain stoicism and a certain sense of its own inherent perfection that you can really see kind of reflected in Sherlock Holmes and his work. Just pay attention to the way that Sherlock Holmes goes about his investigations. He almost always bases his assumptions on things that he notices being out of place, or things that he notices as being unusual or imperfect in a way that an average British person would expect it to be. When Helen Stoner first walks in, he notices mud on her clothes, and he says, "The left arm of your jacket is spattered with mud in no less than 7 places. The marks are perfectly fresh. There's no vehicle save a dog cart which throws up mud in that way, and then only when you sit on the left-hand side of the driver." So he just simply notices these kinds of superficial things and makes snap judgments about them, based on the fact that they are unusual or imperfect. And then later on, he notices just the slight, vague impression of a hand imprint around her wrists that suggests that she's being abused by her stepfather, Roylott. But it's all these little things that he notices as just being out of place that stand out to him. And that speaks to a certain sort of fastidiousness of the British mindset. When things are out of place, it's a matter of suspicion. Another thing to notice is sort of the creeping influence of British imperialism in this story. Pay attention to Roylott's story as told by Helen Stoner. Helen tells Holmes that the family was at one time among the richest in England, and the estate extended over the borders into Berkshire in the north and Hampshire in the west. In the last century, however, 4 successive heirs were of a dissolute and wasteful disposition, and the family ruin was eventually completed by a gambler in the days of the Regency. Nothing was left save for a few acres of ground and the 200-year-old house, which is itself crushed under a heavy mortgage. The last squire dragged out of his existence there, living the horrible life of an aristocratic pauper, but only his son, my stepfather, seeing that he must adapt himself to the new conditions, obtained an advance from a relative which enabled him to take a medical degree and went out to Calcutta, where by his professional skill and his force of character he established a large practice. In a fit of anger, however, caused by some robberies which had been perpetrated in the house, he beat his native butler to death and narrowly escaped a capital sentence. As it was, he suffered a long-term imprisonment and afterwards returned to England a morose and disappointed man. So Roylott was already a volatile man. He was sullen, and he came from a long lineage of people who squandered and wasted a vast family fortune. And then when he goes to India, all of this is made worse. Helen talks about after he came back how much he had changed. Instead of making friends and exchanging visits with their neighbors who had at first been overjoyed to see a Roylott of Stoke Moran back in the family seat, he shut himself up in his house and seldom came out save to indulge in ferocious quarrels with whoever might cross his path. Violence of temper approaching to mania has been hereditary in the men of the family, and in my stepfather's case it had, I believe, been intensified by his long residence in the tropics. A series of disgraceful brawls took place, 2 of which ended in the police court, until at last he became the terror of the village, and the folks would fly at his approach, for he is a man of immense strength and absolutely uncontrollable anger. What Helen says, and what the assumption being made about Roylott basically boils down to, is that he was already predisposed to violence and temper, and then he went and lived in a hotter clime such as India, and it just made him worse. There's so much to unpack just in that alone. The idea that a man from a respectable family in Britain can be irrevocably changed for the worse by not only just leaving Britain, but going to a part of the world that is hotter and more native and primitive. It speaks to a certain assumption that the British had about what it is like in the other parts of the world. That just living in a hotter climate can have a deleterious effect on a person. And of course, Roylott brings all this back with him from India. He not only brings back the hotter temper and the more primitive, violent nature, but he also brings back baboons and cheetahs and wildlife a lot of British people just had never seen before. So he is irrevocably changed just by virtue of having spent time in a place that wasn't Great Britain. But in this sort of perfected British stoicism, one of the funny things is, though, that you can see that Doyle, much like Sherlock Holmes himself, doesn't get all his facts straight. It speaks to a certain incorrectness in the assumptions that the British had about these other places in the world. Just by virtue of the fact that he gets his facts wrong about the snake that ends up being the speckled band at the end. Spoiler alert for a story you should have read by now. But he speaks about the snake that bites Helen Stoner's sister and that is used as a murder weapon, as drinking milk, which snakes do not drink milk. And he summons the snake with a bell. And snakes can't hear in that regard. So Doyle just gets his facts wrong about things that are foreign to him, as one would expect. But it's presented so matter-of-factually that it sort of belies the falseness of some of the things that he's claiming in the story. So in terms of the Gothic elements of the story, first of all, there is Stoke Moran. Stoke Moran is a 200-year-old house that is being described as falling apart. Watson, our narrator, describes Stoke Moran as having an entire wing of the house that is basically falling in on itself and is completely uninhabitable. In this way, Stoke Moran becomes symbolic of the general state of Britain at the time. Well-established, prestigious and revered amongst the people, but also not necessarily in its prime condition at the time. In terms of Gothic literature at this time, Gothic literature had always been focused on natural elements, creepy natural elements, in the same way that some of the Dark Romantics did early on, where most of the stories were set in misty forests or at lonely castles set far away from the rest of society. By this point in literary history, the Gothic tradition had moved into an urban setting, and so it featured these elements of just the kind of shambles that British infrastructure was just sort of suffering at this time. Things that you build get old and fall apart. And so the dilapidation of Stoke Moran is sort of symbolic of just the general state of British infrastructure at the time. There's also just the absolute and clear and unmistakable villainy of a character like Roylott. Someone who at every turn is being described as unstable, violent, physically posing and big in a way that he just sort of looms over people. Not everybody who's big and looms does so with malicious intent. But Roylott, as evil and malignant as he is, has his nature exacerbated by forces that are really beyond his control. He is the victim of heredity, and then he goes to India and has his nature changed surreptitiously just by virtue of being away from Britain and being in a hotter and more primitive climate. You can draw parallels between a character like Roylott and a character like Jekyll/Hyde. Both characters are men of good standing and complexity of character that becomes exacerbated by forces outside of themselves. In Hyde's case, it is chemistry. In Roylott's case, it is geography. All in all, The Speckled Band is a pretty good story to wrap up our Victorian unit with. It speaks to not only the state of literature at the time, in that Sherlock Holmes was a very popular character, in that Sherlock Holmes is featured in short stories that are serialized in journals and magazines, which was a very prominent way of getting your work out at the time. It speaks to the mindset of British people. It speaks to the mindset of British people and their assumptions about themselves and about the rest of the world at the time. And it reveals, perhaps between the lines, the incorrectness about those assumptions, both about themselves, about the perfection of the British mindset, and the stiff upper lipness that sort of defined what it meant to be British at this time. Sherlock Holmes is a character that embodies every bit of what it means to be the ideal British person, someone with impeccable knowledge about nearly every kind of topic you can imagine, someone who pays a lot of close attention to detail and notices things being out of place, someone who is very wealthy but not at all concerned with money or being financially stable at all. In other stories beyond The Speckled Band, it is said several times that Sherlock Holmes just doesn't take cases unless they interest him, belying the fact that he is a professional and that probably most professional detectives wouldn't turn down cases because they need the money. Holmes does not need the money. He is set up very well, and he does what he does because he has the leisure to do things that interest him. Holmes is ideally perfect in just about every way. And in fact, Doyle would give Holmes a bit of a drug addiction problem just to give Holmes some sort of complexity and some sort of flaw. In some stories, it is referred that Holmes enjoys snuff or cocaine. But in typical Holmesian fashion, he is able to control it. He is able to just say, no, I don't want to do that drug anymore. Most of us know that drug addiction just doesn't work that way most of the time. You can't just will yourself against being addicted to something powerful. Doyle would go on to write Sherlock Holmes stories for another 30 years after the publication of The Speckled Band. But at this point, Holmes is kind of the perfect embodiment of what a British person like Arthur Conan Doyle envisioned being the perfect British entail. That's The Speckled Band, that's Arthur Conan Doyle, and that's Victorian literature in a nutshell. Now that we're at the end of the unit, it's time to wrap things up. If you have not submitted your second unit essay, please do so this week. Those of you who have reached out requesting extensions, I have happily granted them. But considering the nature of the beast that we are working with now, the sooner you can get work turned in and the closer to the deadline you can get things done, the less things will snowball on you and pile up as you work through the rest of this class and all your other classes throughout the semester. So the second unit exam is online now. Get those things turned in by the end of the week. Our next video is going to come out Wednesday, and it will be the kickoff for our third and final unit, 20th century literature. And we're going to start with Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad. Go ahead and be reading Joseph Conrad. Go ahead and be reading Heart of Darkness. There will be a quiz and a discussion post online for Friday. I'll see you then.